I'd like to turn your attention this morning to 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15. 1 Timothy 3 and verse 15. When we read, "If I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth." This passage generally is speaking about how individual members of the church ought to behave, how we ought to be. But I want to narrow the focus just a little bit this morning and look at the description that's offered of the church itself in this text. It says that the church is a pillar and a buttress of the truth. The church of the living God is to be a pillar and a buttress of the truth. That word pillar is simply a word that means a support column, a stand, if you will, something that supports, upholds, lifts, strengthens, provides a foundation of which something to be sat upon. The word buttress is a basis for something or a foundation for something. Both of these terms are architectural terms. I think that we recognize in Greek architecture the great use of columns, of pillars to support buildings. We recognize in Roman architecture and in Gothic architecture of Europe the buttresses. Buttresses tend to be things that, at least at one point in time, were on the outside of buildings that were built up along the walls of the building at an angle to offer support. In Gothic times in Europe, something called a flying buttress was created. Those things were in the air, but they're all the same thing, which is this: a structure, a foundational structure on which the building can be erected. The imagery here is that the church is such a foundation, is such a structure, is such a skeleton to hold something, and there's something particular in mind. He says to be a pillar and a buttress of the truth. And there's something about that I want us to understand, that there is a particular truth under consideration. The definite article is used here. This isn't just a pillar and buttress of truth. It's not just a pillar and buttress of a truth, but it is the pillar and buttress of a particular objective truth that originates with and belongs to God. That truth which was made known to man by God. That is the truth that it is talking about. It is not talking about mathematical truth. It is not talking about human science, physical science truth. It's not talking about an understanding of one subject or another subject on the earth. It's talking specifically about an objective body of truth that was delivered by God to men. That body of truth which was once for all delivered is how it's talked about in the book of Jude. The church's job is to be a structure upon which that truth can be held up, be seen, be encountered, and be benefited by for the world. The world doesn't have the option to take shelter in the truth if the church isn't the pillar and buttress of that truth. The world, in fact, doesn't know about that truth unless the church is doing its duty. What are we talking about when we talk about the truth? Well, the psalmist in Psalm 119, verse 160 of the 119th Psalm says this: "The sum of your word is truth." Speaking there about God, the psalmist says that the sum total of all that God has said and revealed to man, that is the truth. John 17:17, Jesus says, "Sanctify them in the truth." And then he defines what he means by that. Your word is truth. And so when we're talking about the truth, we're talking about the sum total of God's revelation, the Word of God, that is able to sanctify man, that's able to set us apart, that's able to make us pure, that's able to make priests out of us, that's able to transform our minds, to transform our behavior, to make us a reflection of His righteousness. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. Back in John chapter 8 and verse 31, Jesus said to the Jews who had believed Him, "If you abide in my word." And so we're talking here about the things that Jesus Himself came to deliver and came to speak, and the things that He taught. If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So as we read this, we're talking about the church being the supporter and upholder of God's truth on earth. The truth that is able to set men free, to loose us from sin and from the death that is attached to sin, to grant us life, to grant us hope, to instruct our ways, to light our path, to provide for us a means to understand what is good and what is right and what is pure, what is heavenly, what is righteous. The church's job is to be the foundational structure upon which that truth is presented to mankind. How you ought to conduct yourself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God. The pillar and buttress of the truth. What does that look like is what we're going to ask this morning. What does it look like for the church to be the pillar and the buttress of the truth? What are we supposed to do? How do we carry that out in our living? It's great to know that that's the duty of the church. It's great to know that that's the purpose of the church. But unless we're doing something, then it's not happening. And so we want to talk about what it is that we have to do. I would suggest to you, first of all, that being the pillar and buttress of the truth is reflected in the speech of the church. The things that we talk about and the way that we talk about them. In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 15 and 25, Paul writes to the church at Ephesus, and he says, "Rather, speaking the truth in love, we're to grow up in every respect, or in every way, unto Him who is the head, into Christ." Speaking the truth in love. Part of being the pillar and support of the truth is that we vocalize, we speak that truth, but we don't just speak truth. There's a motive behind the speaking of this truth. There's a way in which we go about it. We don't use the truth to bludgeon people. We don't use the truth to destroy people. We don't use the truth to crush people's spirit. We don't use the truth to try to destroy them, but instead we use the truth to exercise love, to help, to support, to lift up, to strengthen, to correct, to serve. And so we have to understand two things. And there's that one line where Paul very famously tells someone, "Have I become your enemy because I tell you the truth?" We have to understand that sometimes when we speak the truth, people will not understand that our motive is their best interest and their concern, that what we're doing is demonstrating love toward them. That's the situation that Paul was talking about. He was speaking the truth in love, but the person that was listening to him didn't recognize that. And so sometimes there's a problem on the receiving end. They don't understand the nature of love or the motive with which we're speaking. Sometimes we don't really have love. We speak the truth to prove that we're right. We speak the truth to prove that they're wrong. We speak the truth to insinuate that they are less valuable or less worthy or less noble or less honorable than we are. That's not speaking the truth in love. When we speak the truth in love, it should be spoken in such a way that it lifts them up and helps make them more honorable, more noble, more equal, more acceptable. So, he says that the church is to be a group of people who actively both in concert and as individuals, speak the truth in love, growing up in every way toward Christ. And then down in verse 25, he says, having put away falsehood. That's the opposite of speaking truth. We put that away. We get rid of that. We quit doing that. We don't tell people things that are not the truth of God. Having put away falsehood, let each of you speak the truth with his neighbor. And the language here means that I'm not just speaking the truth to me, and I'm not just speaking the truth to those people who live in my household. And I'll point out to you that our passage that we started with talks about the fact that the church of the living God is the household of God. It's not just something that we speak to each other. It's something we speak to our neighbors. Now, here's the question. Who's our neighbor? What does our neighbor look like? If I'm going to speak the truth to my neighbor, don't I need to know who my neighbor is? You'll recall, maybe, the story in Luke chapter 10 it's recorded in verses 25 through verse 37. And here we have a man, he sets out on a journey. He's got somewhere to go. Some robbers are lying in wait for him on the side of the road. They attack him, they beat him, they rob him, and they leave him for dead. And then there are three different people that pass by after he's been discarded on the side of the road and left for dead. There's a priest, and he ignores him. There's a Levite, and he ignores him. And there's a Samaritan. And the Samaritan stops. And the Samaritan renders aid. And the Samaritan even goes beyond that. He doesn't just stop and render aid. He then loads the man up on his own beast, and he carries the man into town and brings him to an inn and gives him to the innkeeper and gives the innkeeper some money and says, look, use this to care for him until he is healthy, and if it costs more when I come back through, I'll settle up the debt with you. Then you'll recall that Jesus asked the question, who proved to be the neighbor? Was it the priest among the Jews? No, that's not what the neighbor looked like. Now, that's what we think of as a neighbor, right? Our brethren, they're our neighbors. They're our friends. They're the people that we have a relationship with and that we're close to. That's what our neighbor is. He says, no, it's not the priest. It's not the Levite. He didn't prove to be the neighbor. Which one proved to be the neighbor? And by the way, don't look at this from the wrong direction. This isn't, how do I see these three people? It's how these three people see me. The fact of the matter is, most of us would see the Samaritan the way that most Jews would have seen the Samaritan, as the outsider, as the person who's not my neighbor, as the person who's different than me, as the person that I don't need to worry about going to. I need to take care of my fellow Jews. I need to take care of the people that live in my community. I need to take care of the people who go to synagogue with me. But the Samaritans, they're dirty people. The Samaritan, however, the Samaritan proved to be a neighbor. Here's the lesson. Your neighbor isn't necessarily the Levite. Your neighbor isn't necessarily the priest. Your neighbor is the Samaritan. When he tells the church, speak truth with your neighbor, he's not talking about the people who look like you. He's not talking about just the people who live like you. He's not talking about just the people who live close to you, who live on your side of town, who have a job like you have, who do the things like you do, who dress like you, who talk like you, who behave like you. No. He's talking about those people that may very well be completely different from you. Speak truth with those people. Speak truth with the Samaritans. Speak truth to the Greeks. Speak truth to your neighbor. That's what we ought to be doing. The people that live in Lafayette, Louisiana should hear the truth from our mouths. They should know what we believe. They should know what we stand for. They should know what God has said because we told them what God has said. Speak truth with your neighbor. Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 17, God says this, whoever speaks the truth gives honest evidence. But a false witness utters deceit. If I'm not speaking the truth, I'm a false witness. It's an interesting word that's translated in this verse, gives honest evidence. That word that's translated honest evidence, it's one word that's translated by those two English words. It literally means according to God's standard. Speak truth means to speak the standard that has been given by God. It's the exact same thing Peter talked about when he said, if you speak the oracles of God. Say what God said. The church's primary purpose is to speak the objective truth that was delivered to this world by Jesus. A truth that John was inspired by God to affirm to us in John chapter 1 and verse 17. Truth came through Jesus Christ, he wrote. It's our job to make sure that everyone knows what Jesus taught. Everyone knows what Jesus' doctrine was. Everyone knows the things that he has instructed us in the ways of righteousness. That's our job. That's what it means to be the pillar and buttress of the truth. Psalm 15 and verse 1. O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? It's an interesting question, is it, right? Who's going to be living with God in God's house? Who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill? He who walks blamelessly and does what is right and speaks truth. And then he says this, and speaks truth in his heart. Here's something else we need to understand. We don't just need to speak truth to others. We don't just need to tell others about what God said. We need to be honest with ourselves about what God said. That truth should emanate and arise from within our own heart. It's God's truth. It's external. It came from him. But I need to consume it to the point that it becomes a spring of water welling up from within myself. Where it comes from my heart. Where it's the way that I think. It's the judgments that I have. It's genuine, it's real, it's sincere, it's honest. The prophet Zechariah in chapter 8 and verse 16 says this, these are the things that you should do. Speak the truth to one another. Render in your gates judgments that are true, and make for peace. We ought to be an honest people that go around sharing the revelation of God. That should be the nature of the way in which we use the gift of communication that God gave us. God empowered us to share information with one another, to help one another come to know and understand things. I was at a local diner just yesterday morning, actually, having coffee with a few guys, and one of them asked me a question, and when you ask me questions about the Bible, you're going to get answers. And I began to talk with him. We actually had a long conversation. In this diner where there were a lot of people, and they were all talking very loudly, and it was loud, so I was speaking loud enough that the people sitting at the table with me could hear me. And there was a couple that was in a booth behind us. And I noticed as I was talking that she was looking my direction a lot. And they got up to leave. They got up to leave before we left. And she walked over to me and she put her hand on me. And she said, I want you to know that I agree with everything that you're saying. But could you not say it so loud? There are these young people sitting over here in the corner. And I thought, they need to hear it too. See, what she was worried about is that my view of the world, that my understanding of truth, that my understanding of these things was going to offend them, hurt their feelings, and conflict or clash with what they believed to be true. That's exactly what God is saying we're supposed to do. That we're supposed to give voice to the truth that He revealed, so that it does conflict and clash with my thinking and your thinking and their thinking, and teach us the way that is right. To be the pillar and buttress of the truth means that it has to be spoken. It has to be announced. It has to be proclaimed. Those young people needed to hear the truth. That's exactly what the church is supposed to do. Proclaim it so that people come into contact with it and see what is different about their conception, their belief, and what God has said. That's what it looks like. If people come into contact with this church as a corporate body or individuals from this church, they should never be able to walk away saying, well, I heard this and I heard that, but I didn't hear anything that God said. What they should walk away saying is there is no doubt they were speaking the truth. We could read for ourselves the things that they were saying. They cited so that we could check and see if these things were so. They spoke the truth. Now, they may not agree with it. They may not like it. We may become their enemy because they hear it. That's what Paul was talking about. Have I become your enemy because I tell you the truth? That may be the case. We may become someone's enemy because we tell them the truth. But I would much rather them leave me as an enemy because I told them the truth than leave me having not heard the truth. Because our job is to be the foundation and support of the truth. What people should say about the South College Road Church in the city of Lafayette is they speak the truth from the Word of God. They teach what the Bible says. Secondly, it should be reflected in our conduct. Galatians chapter 2 and verse 5. To them we do not yield in submission for even a moment. He's talking there about some Judaizing teachers, some folks that would have people desert the gospel of Christ and go back to the law of Moses. We did not yield in submission for even a moment so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved. Our behavior should be such that we preserve the truth of the gospel. Down in verse 14. When I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force Gentiles to live like Jews? When we see people's conduct not in accord with the truth, our conduct should be that we say to them, why? Why are you saying that? Why are you doing that? Why are you teaching this? Why are you behaving that way? God said. That's what he's talking about when he talks about behaving in such a way that the gospel might be preserved. You don't allow people to go through this life believing things and doing things and saying things contrary to the gospel and never warning them that it's contrary to the revelation of God. They can go through their entire life if no one ever warns them that what they believe or what they're doing is in conflict with what God has said, believing that what they are doing is in line with what God said. And then our conduct is no longer preserving the truth of God. It's allowing the truth of God to vanish, to be lost. to be hidden. And you know what Jesus said about that, right? You don't light a lamp to put it under a basket and hide it. No. You put it on a stand in the center of the room so that it gives light to the whole room. That's the church. We're the stand from which the light of the truth is supposed to shine and give light to the entire world around us. They should see it. Not just hear it from our mouth. They should see it in the way we live. They should see the passion. They should see the zeal. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 22, having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth. Our conduct. Reflected in our conduct. Our obedience to the truth ought to be seen. Not only should we say this is what God said, but people should look at our lives and say, he's doing what God said. He's living the righteousness of God. He's not only saying to me that God said that that's not righteous and that this is righteous, but he's actually doing in his life what God said. Having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth for a sincere brotherly love, love one another earnestly from the heart. There is a connection with love. There's a connection with purity of heart. There's a connection with all of those things and obedience to the truth. I cannot have a pure heart, and I cannot love earnestly from that pure heart if my conduct doesn't reflect the truth. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 12. Therefore, I intend always to remind you of these qualities. That's the speaking the truth thing. I'm going to remind you of these qualities. The conduct side of it is the fact that there are, in fact, qualities of life, behaviors, characteristics that define someone who is in obedience to the truth. I'm going to remind you of these qualities, though you know them and are established in the truth. That's what we need to be. We need to be established in the truth. Our conduct should arise from the truth. It should direct our steps. It should define how we treat people, how we think of people, how we speak to people. 1 John chapter 1 and verse 6, if we say we have fellowship with him, him being God, if we say we have fellowship with him, while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. We need to practice truth. Now, that doesn't mean that we go along and we attempt occasionally to do what's right, and we go to a practice session on Thursday where we're trying to do it. Now, practice the truth means practice the truth like you practice law, you practice medicine, or you engage in any other skill. That you limit and discipline your behavior, your focus, your speech, your conduct, your manner of life within the parameters of that thing. You practice the truth. In other words, it can be seen in your conduct. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 18. Little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. By this we shall know that we are of the truth and reassure our heart before him. We need to practice the truth. Our deeds need to reflect the truth. And that's how it can be known that we are of the truth. People in this community, whatever they may say about us, whether they like us or they don't like us, whether they agree with us or they don't agree with us, they ought to be able to say, they do and say the things that you read about in this book. They are of the Word. Not themselves. Not their own judgments about what's right or wrong. Not their own desires about what they want to see done or not done. But it's clear that what they're doing is, to the best of their ability, following the Scripture. By this we shall know that we are of the truth and reassure our heart before him. What a wonderful thing to be able to reassure your heart before God, to know where you stand with God. to be able to face death without fear. I watched it. I heard it. If it's the will of God, let it be. It's part of living. I'm not afraid because he was assured and reassured by his behavior and conduct. Second John chapter 1 and verse 4, I rejoice greatly to find some of your children walking in the truth, just as we were commanded by the Father. Two things about this. First off, there is such a thing as walking in the truth. That just simply means living the truth out in our lives. And the second thing to note is the second phrase that tells us that the idea of walking in the truth is a commandment from God, just as we were commanded by the Father. That's what God desires us to do, to walk according to his revelation. Finally, the third letter of John, verse 8. We ought to support people like these that we may be fellow workers of the truth. There's work to be done. There's work that is done when you walk in the truth. There is work that is done when you are of the truth. There is work that is done when you practice the truth. And we should be fellow workers of the truth. The truth is exemplified in behavior, not just in speech. It's not just a body of knowledge. It's characteristics of life, of behavior. It's a way of living that we need to exemplify. I want to leave you with a few questions and a couple of more observations. If the church doesn't speak the truth, who will? The truth that comes from God is not something that you just automatically know, nor is it something that you absorb by osmosis. It's not something that you figure out with a blank sheet of paper and a pencil where you sit down and collect all the data and say, you know, I've determined through my careful consideration of all of this data that this is right and this is wrong and this is how you ought to live. That's not how people come to a knowledge of the truth. The only way to come to the truth of God is to listen to God. And if the church isn't speaking the truth, how is anyone going to know it? If the church doesn't exemplify truth through our conduct, who's going to? Do we expect the world to exemplify the truth of God through their conduct? You know what God says about that? If you see injustice in the camp, don't be surprised. That's just what men do. If we expect to see anyone doing things that are right, that are good, that are godly, it ought to be ourselves that we expect to behave in that way. God has spoken the truth to us. Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Long ago, and many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. He's talking there about the prophets of the Old Testament. Long ago, he spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the world. He's spoken. He's spoken through the prophets. He's spoken through his Son. He came all the way out of heaven. He took on flesh. He lived a life on this earth, and he suffered in part to be able to impart to us the knowledge of righteousness, the will of God. The one that created the world, the heir of all things, spoke to us so that we would have a knowledge of these things. If the truth is not heard and seen in this world, it is not God's failure. God did his part. God spoke through the prophets. God sent his Son into the world to speak to us. The preaching was done. The revelation was completed. And it's not the world's failure either. The world isn't the pillar and buttress of the truth. If the truth isn't heard and seen in this world, it's our failure. It's the church's fault. It's me who is failing. It's you who is failing. It is our brethren the world over who are failing to speak and to conduct themselves in such a way that they are upholding and providing a foundation upon which that the world is exposed to the truth. If we want to recognize the church of the living God, we need to look for a collection of people who speak the truth in love. That's what you find when you find the church of the living God. We need to look for a group of people who conduct themselves according to the truth, exemplifying the truth, demonstrating it for others to see, who make themselves an example of believers. What does a believer look like? Well, that's what a believer looks like. That's what Paul wrote to Timothy, that he should conduct himself such that he would be an example of those who believe. In fact, let's read about that. Turn to 1 Timothy chapter 4. 1 Timothy chapter 4, starting in verse 12. Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity. Until I come, devote yourself to the public reading of Scripture, to exhortation, to teaching. Do not neglect the gift you have, which was given to you by prophecy when the council of elders laid their hands on you. Practice these things. Immerse yourself in them. Practice. To what degree? He says, immerse yourself in them, so that all may see your progress. Keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching. Persist in this, for by so doing you will save both yourself and your hearers. That's what the world needs. The world needs the church to be the pillar and buttress of the truth. The world needs the church to speak out about what is right. And the world needs the church to be full of men and women who live it in their lives and demonstrate through their speech, through their conduct, through their love, through their faith, through their purity, what it looks like to be a believer. When we do our part, God will do His. Paul wrote, I planted and Apollos watered. God gave the increase. That's what we need to be, and that's what we need to make certain that we are, so that we can behave as we ought in the church of the living God, which is the pillar and the buttress of the truth.